Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve. You can find show notes, how to contact me, and sign up for our mailing list, and additionally, how to support The History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Speaking of supporting the show, Patreon is a great way to do that. We're at patreon.com/history of the papacy. There's 4 tiers representing the 4 traditional patriarchates of Christianity: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Inclusion on the History of the Papacy diptychs, bonus audio, and monthly book drawings, along with early content and ad-free content, are all yours if you join up on the History of the Papacy on Patreon. A little History of the Papacy diptychs and papacy fun fact: Pepin the Short was in large part responsible for ending the Byzantine era of the papacy and beginning the Middle Ages era of the papacy with his donation of Pepin. Also, he probably wasn't that short. The short probably came from him being the younger Pepin, not his diminutive stature. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, and William H. at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, and Alex the Great. As you know, we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring Richard Lim and his This American President podcast, among many other great podcasts. This episode begins a series of episodes featuring Will Clark of the Gray History podcast. Right now, Will is focused on the French Revolution. The French Revolution is a key event in our series that we're currently doing on Pius IX and the end of the secular power of the Roman Papacy. Now, in today's episode, Will and I will build background information on the relationship between France and the papacy that went all the way back to the really early Middle Ages and really into late antiquity. Make sure you check out Will's Gray History podcast. That's Gray spelled with an E. Now, with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. So today we're talking about the French Revolution and kind of setting a little bit of the stage of what was going on with the papacy and the Catholic Church. I'm really happy and excited to talk with Will of Gray History. I'm loving the Gray History. I'm burning through episodes trying to get caught up.
Well, thank you for that, Steve. It's there's a little bit of a library to get there, and each episode gets a little longer, I think, as time goes on. So there's just a little bit more to do as you catch it up. I'm also enjoying. I'm jumping in and out of various episodes of the History of the Papacy podcast as well, and it's I've been listening to the Pontifex pod as well, so I feel like I'm knee deep in pontifical history at the moment, which I'm loving.
And it's exciting because papal history and Catholic Church history is so intertwined with French history, and especially the French Revolution, that it'll be really great for both of our audiences to get on the same page with what's going on with those two really important aspects of French history and European history.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that you cannot talk about the French Revolution without talking about the history of the Catholic Church and the role that the Catholic Church and the papacy plays in how the revolution evolves. It's just so critical. And then likewise, you can't talk about, not only the history of the modern world, but in particular, you can't talk about modern church history and the position of the Pope now without looking at just how impactful the revolution was in terms of really how we think of the Pope today, as opposed to maybe the powers and the position of the Pope in European society, pre-revolutionary times.
Yeah, absolutely. The Catholic Church in France goes back a long, long way. And really, it starts all the way back before there even was a France with the Franks, and there's Clovis, and you can go back and listen to episodes to get more details. But there's a lot of big names in pre-France, Franks, and then going into when there is more of a proper France. But then some of the big names are Martin of Tours, St. John Cassian, who's really the father of Western monasticism. He founded his monastery in southern modern-day France. Catholic practice in France really took on its own flair or flavor, if you will. It had its own tweaks to the Mass, to the liturgy. It had its own version of their chant, etc. And that really wasn't unusual for the time. Visigothic Spain had its own, Anglo-Saxon England, Ireland, different parts of Italy, and the German states all took their own individual takes on certain aspects of the liturgy and all aspects of Christianity. And diversity of practice was not unusual. It's really a modern being maybe the last 200 years, that there was really an idea that there should be one practice that was really based on the Roman practice. I mean, you even go back to Augustine in the 400s, and he asks Ambrose of Milan, oh, they're not doing things right in this place. I think he was in Milan, he was in Rome, and Augustine was accustomed to the practices of Milan, and Ambrose just tells him to take a break. That's where you do as the Romans. But a big theme in papal history from this point all the way back in the antiquity forward is that the popes are fighting to secure control over the papal states, which we'll get into in a minute, and exercise authority over Christendom, mostly the western part of Europe at this point, but also dipping their toe into the East in religious affairs. And those are the two really big themes that set the stage for all of the Middle Ages and really even all the way to the modern age.
Yeah, well, if you think about, the Pope pretty much, as a Prince of Rome as well, has long been in contest with the various powers and rulers, and then eventually, as we get to more state-like entities, as we move into the Middle Ages, he's just kind of continuously jostling for power, not only from a religious authority perspective, but also a secular authority perspective. And I think a lot of my listeners might be surprised at just how much temporal power the popes had, and also how involved in government affairs the church was, in terms of, if you look at how powerful some would say the bishops were in the Holy Roman Empire, call it 1,000 years ago, I think it would astonish a lot of people nowadays that weren't quite familiar with the power of the church then. And it might be worth maybe you jumping into some of the roles, the kind of responsibilities that nowadays we would consider to be part of a secular government, that the church was actually responsible for in this time. The various pies that the Pope and his cardinals and bishops had their fingers in, so to speak.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. Yeah, if you go back to antiquity, when the Roman Empire fell in the West, the church was really the only organization that was standing that could take care of the day-to-day things that the Roman Empire took care of. Security to some degree in a lot of places, the bishop was the only person around who could get the militia together on the walls. It's, all sorts of simple things like taking alms to the poor. The Catholic Church was almost the default fallback to what I say, taking out the garbage and just the general things that make a society run. There was these Germanic kings. They didn't have a lot of interest or even the organizational skill to take over these functions that the Roman Empire had left behind, and the church was the last man standing.
Well, and that makes sense. I mean, if you think about the position that they had from a spiritual and moral authority, it would have been easier for them to kind of take up that mantle, so to speak, that was left behind by some of the institutions of the Roman Empire.
Now, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, it takes a big turn in the 750s. Prior to that period, for about 250 years, the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire had really dominated the papacy. The Byzantines controlled most of the Italian peninsula, and that started to shrink. But Rome was firmly under Byzantine control for a long time, up until the 700s. The popes of Rome were basically vassals of the Byzantine emperor or one of his designees. They couldn't be officially consecrated until they got the stamp of approval of the Byzantine emperor. All that really, evolutionarily, it was changing because the Byzantines were getting beaten back in Italy and their powers were shrinking into certain sections of the northern part of the peninsula and the southern part of the peninsula. After 752, Pope Zachary gave the nod to Pepin the Frank to take power officially in the Frankish court. The Pepin was kind of the de facto leader of France over the Merovingians, but he wanted de jure power, and the Pope helped with that. And in appreciation, Pepin donated a certain section of land that he had conquered in the Italian peninsula. What would eventually become the Papal States was given to the Pope as their own territory. So the Pope was the religious power there, but the Pope was also the secular leader of that little duchy or proto-state, whatever you want to call it. The other thing that starts to develop is who was going to appoint bishops. And that was a major, major issue because, like you were saying, well, bishops had a vast amount of power. And in a lot of places, the bishop might actually be the secular leader as well as the religious leader. And they were just in control of vast amounts of wealth and land. Also, the up and coming monasteries, which the monastery was basically the economic engine of a lot of these areas. And who would be the one to appoint them? Obviously, both the popes thought that was a part of his religious power, and with some side benefits of also controlling the economy. Whereas on the flip side, the secular leaders thought that, well, hey, this is a major economic part of my empire or my kingdom. And, I get the side benefit of appointing the religious leader too. So you can definitely see where there's going to be a major point of contact there, or point of conflict there, I should say.
Absolutely. And then, I'm sure you'll get into this as it relates to the French church and the particular kind of prerogatives that the French kings insisted upon having in terms of nominating the bishops within their realms eventually. But you've got to remember to build on your point that, for those members of the audience that aren't necessarily as familiar with, how to think about this particular topic, is that when you're thinking about bishops, because they have so much control over economically valuable pieces of land and entire economies, entire towns and small urban communities, not only do they possess significant wealth, and we're in a time now where land means power and land means wealth far more than it does today. But it also means that bishops actually have small armies or at least forces that they can contribute to a king. So when you see civil wars and civil strife, particularly in Europe, and I'm thinking at the moment in particular of the Holy Roman Empire, people will call upon bishops for the wealth that they can offer a particular campaign, but also the military forces as well. So, these positions of religious authority were really temporal leaders as well. They were the leaders of their own little duchies or bishoprics or states. Proto-state would be a better term for it. But they were much more of a ruler in everyday government affairs than we would think of bishops today. And then the two roles compared to how we think of a bishop today and how a bishop was, say, 1,000 years ago are vastly different.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out for sure. And just to jump off of that, and I'm sure both of us along the way will be using terms like Italy and France, England, Germany, but those places wouldn't exist for a long, long time. Germany was Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of duchies, and France was in the same situation. Spain, they're all a total patchwork of medieval fiefdoms, and that had all these different connections to each other, and they were not states as such. England was probably the only one that would really get something close to what we might think of as a modern state.
Well, the way I describe it is, particularly when you're thinking about the Holy Roman Empire, is that if you get like, if you kind of put down a map of modern day Europe and you got a glue stick, I don't know if that's what you call it in the States, but there's some glue, and you put it all over modern day Germany, a little bit of Switzerland, a little bit of Eastern France, Western Poland, Austria, etc. And then you pick up like a bucket of glitter and throw it at that map, and then pick up the map and shake it off a little bit, and then look at all this colorful little beautiful artwork that you've created. And if each one of those pieces of glitter was its own independent political entity, that's the Holy Roman Empire. And it's a slight exaggeration, but you're literally, you're talking about at times hundreds of little independent cities, independent towns, bishoprics, duchies, provinces. It's just chaotic, and that didn't exactly exist to the same extent in, say, France or Italy, but you did have a range of territories, larger duchies, provinces, etc. And in the case of France, what that resulted is as the French state grew, it was inheriting all these independent political entities. So as they became part of the French state, they brought in all sorts of independent customs and traditions as well. So at this point in time, yes, when we're talking about France, and to your point, as we're talking about France and Italy and Germany, what we're really talking about is the political entities that were located in these modern states, but these modern states did not exist. In the case of Italy and Germany, they didn't exist as unified states until the 1800s.
Also, culturally, each one of these places there was a lot of bleeding through with culture, with language. You could go from one village to the next and get almost what you might, even though nominally they're speaking French or Italian or German, they're almost completely different languages. If you get a county or a duchy or a province a few away, and the thread that was really connecting all of these disparate places together was not a national identity. It was the idea that they're all Catholic, that the idea of Christendom was really people's identity over and above any proto-national idea.
Yeah, well, it's not. I mean, some historians make the point that it's not until the French Revolution that we start to see what we would consider to be modern day or modern nationalism. And to your point, even when the French Revolution commenced, the amount of non-French speakers, or the amount of even French speakers that, say, the average Parisian would have quite a fair bit of difficulty communicating with, was a significant proportion of the country. And you also just had people that just didn't speak French along the eastern border, for example. You'd have a lot of German speakers. And that's actually part of why the church was so important, because one of the few ways that the old regime, and by that I mean the regime of kings that existed before the revolution, one of the few ways that they could actually get things done was by working with the church, because they would work with local priests and cures and bishops to disseminate royal edicts and royal proclamations. And that was one of the few ways that they could actually, govern a country, in the case of France, that was so non-homogeneous in nature, in terms of its culture and in terms of its language.
And the whole idea of a lingua franca, of Latin was a key way of administration to just tie all of these disparate things together. And it wouldn't be until, like you're saying, the French Revolution and the time after that countries are going to invent basically schooling systems to teach a standard dialect of French, Italian, English, and probably in a lot of reasons today, that's why you and I, even speaking English, can speak to each other. If things had been a little different, we might not have been able to over the course of generations, even communicate with each other in English. We'd be speaking our own regional dialects, and we'd have to speak something like Latin or something together to be able to even communicate.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's probably a few people that think Australian slang is complicated enough even with it. But yeah, it's one of those things that, I mean, you know, you mentioned education. It's one of those things where the revolution actually took an awful lot of time focused on education and how to overhaul the education system in the creation of a modern French state. Now, unfortunately, the Revolutionary Wars kind of took precedence in terms of their focus and their attention, and so they didn't get to implement all their grand plans. But again, things like a standardized national language and a standardized national education system, they are quite modern ideas. And prior to that, it was the church that played a large role in education and communication across geographies that, to your point, you know, might have had very little to do with each other except for their common faith. Or at least until the Reformation, when their common faith became a little less common.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. There's a couple more points I think that are worth bringing up just to get us all on the same page going into the late 18th century, and at least in the papal church part of this equation is the Avignon papacy, and then the suppression of the Templars. I mean, we're skipping a lot of things. We're skipping the Crusades, but I think these couple of key points will at least illuminate kind of what was going on. And with the Avignon papacy, that was basically a time where the French monarchs took over the papacy and the curia and the whole apparatus of the Catholic Church during most of the 1300s. Avignon is a city in southern France, and it's interesting because it's almost near where Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, I believe part of the papal enclave of Avignon, bordered the Holy Roman Empire, even though in today's terms, Avignon is pretty securely inside of France. I mean, that shows you how complicated that time period was. This whole Avignon papacy was a very ugly time in papal history. It's also the time of the Black Death. So there's a lot of pretty rough and tumble stuff going on there. During this time period, the popes were French and the cardinals were mostly French, and it was fairly much completely run by the French kings. All of this wouldn't end until the Council of Constance in 1418, where there was 3 popes at the time. There was a movement always to get things back to Rome. Of course, the French kind of liked what was going on with having it in Avignon, but there was a pope in Rome. I think there might have been 2 popes in Rome, and then there's the pope in Avignon. And basically, the Council of Constance said all of them got to go, and we're going to pick a new person. And it was probably what actually saved the papacy as an institution, because I mean, how long could it go on having 3 claimants? I mean, it was that can't go on forever. One thing that happened slightly before, but kind of at the same time as the transition to the Avignon papacy, was the suppression of the Templars. And the papacy was pretty on board with the Templars. And with the Templars, that's a whole its own can of worms, but it was basically the French kings were totally in hock to the Templars financially, and they wanted the Templars out of the way. The popes found that the Templars were still a pretty useful organization, but the popes wound up just caving entirely to what the French king wanted. There's also a rise of something called Gallicanism, which the French church, it was really the French church separating itself from the church in general. They were still in communion with Rome and with Spain and all the other Catholic churches, but they were really trying to emphasize the Frenchness of their church. Kind of like, if anybody's familiar with the Eastern churches, the Church of Bulgaria, the Church of Russia, Constantinople, Romania, they're all independent of each other, but they're all kind of pulling in the same direction, you might say. The Gallican Church, they wanted to really be their own thing, with the Pope of Rome as sort of a titular first among equals. but the day-to-day operations were going to be all in-house inside of the French church or the Gallican church. Then we get the Protestant Reformation, and that's a major pinch on papal religious power, but really doesn't change anything going on inside of the papal state, the secular power. But then at the same time, when you have the power of the popes contracting in Europe, they lose basically half of the continent to the Protestant Reformation. There's a huge expansion of the Catholic Church in the New World, in North America, South America, and the East, the Far East of Asia. Then in the 1500s, there's a really big pushback by the Catholic Church of the Counter-Reformation, and you get the rise of the Jesuits, who are really starting to push back on the Protestants. Then the one last thing, and that's the major part of the Counter-Reformation, is the Council of Trent in the 1500s, and that's where we get the idea starting of a much more muscular papacy on religious terms and secular terms. And it won't always play out successfully, but it's the idea is starting to get set that the popes have this secular power in the papal states, but they also are supreme, or they should be supreme, amongst the Catholic Church. Now, in France, you have the rise of the Huguenots, and then they really get pushed down with they're severely persecuted. A lot of them wind up going to North America and the colonies of the English colonies of North America, and that really leaves. France doesn't get super affected by the Protestant Reformation, and it really does remain a Catholic state, but it's also influenced by the Protestants in that they want some freedom from the papacy. And we'll kind of see how that plays out going into the French Revolution in the later part of the 18th century.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, so that if you think about the Reformation in France, yes, when France gets to the French Revolution, it's predominantly a Catholic country. About 97% of the population is nominally Catholic. But like many countries during that kind of Reformation period and immediately afterwards, there was quite a bit of religious and civil unrest as a result of the Reformation. And you've already mentioned the Huguenots there. In the kind of the latter half of the 1500s, France experienced quite considerable amounts of civil war, or religious-inspired civil war, because of the Protestant and Catholic churches or members of their communities that had become either Protestant or had become Protestant instead of Catholic. And it's actually worth noting that 2 successive French kings were assassinated as a direct result of the religious tensions of those times. So Henry III and Henry IV. And so it was, even though France came through that period of time nominally quite a Catholic country, in part because of some of the reforms that Louis XIV introduced in the decades after that unrest, it didn't escape it entirely. And so while you don't have a situation like you say have in some of the states of the Holy Roman Empire, which had quite large Christian minorities, you do, France, was by no means immune to some of that unrest.
Yeah, it really, that you make the point that France was about 97% Catholic, and there really was a spectrum where you have the Enlightenment coming up, where people are, especially in certain quarters of the society, are starting to break away from religion. But then you have a core who are super Catholic, but even within that, they're starting to bifurcate into groups that are really pro-papal, but also groups that are really pro-Gallican or for a national regional church. So even amongst the religious, you're getting splits.